Imitation of Death by Lester Del Rey, originally published in Future combined with science fiction stories, May and June 1950. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Max Fleigh's heavy jowls relaxed, and he chuckled without humour as he examined the knots that bound the man at his feet. Quite impersonally, he planted the toe of his boot in Curtis's ribs, listened with a muffled grunt of pain, and decided that the gag was effective. For once, Slim had done a good job, and there was nothing wrong. It was probably unnecessary anyway, but there could be no bungling when the future of the Plutarchy was at stake. Incompetence had cost them an empire once, and there would be no third opportunity. The stupid democracy that had called themselves a world union had colonized the planets and ruled them without plan. And when Mars, Venus, and the Jovian worlds had revolted and set up a planet council, all that Earth could do was to come crawling to it, begging polite permission to join what they should have owned. But that had been before practical realists had kicked out the dreamers and set up the Plutarchy under an iron discipline that could implement its plans. Now they were heading back toward their lost empire, colonizing the asteroids and establishing claims that gave them a rough rule over the outlaws who had retreated there. With a council softened up by years of cautious propaganda, they were in a position to ask and receive a mandate over the scattered planetoids. It was the opening wedge, and all they needed. Once the asteroids could be given spurious independence to seek a council seat, they would be ready to strike at the Jovian worlds. With proper incidents, propaganda, and quislings, plus the planetoids to separate Jupiter from Mars, there could be no question of the outcome. Earth would gain a majority of these votes, and the council would be the basis of a new and greater Plutarchy. Fleigh gave the bound body of Curtis another careless kick, and went forward to the cabin, where the lanky form of his companion was hunched dourly over the controls of the little spacecraft. "How's it going, Slim?" "So-so." Slim ejected a green stream of narcotic juice and grinned sourly. "But I still say we've been crowding our luck too hard." "Rot. Lay out the right moves, cover all possibilities, outmaneuver your enemies, and you don't need luck. Ever played chess?" "Nope, can't say I did. Played the horses on Mars, though. Time we histed on Ephemeron. One do. After I bought my lucky ghost charm. Been in the chips ever since." Slim's grin widened, but his face remained stubbornly unconvinced. Fleigh chuckled. If the planetoid outlaws depended on magic, while the council visionaries spouted sentimental twaddle, so much the better for the realists. "Charms don't work in politics, Slim. We have to anticipate resistance, and you saw what happened to our fine Martian Councillor Curtis when he decided to expose us and ruin the mandate." "Yeah." Slim's yellow teeth chewed thoughtfully on his cud. "Suppose he'd stood on Mars, though. We'd have dropped hints of just the information he needed on Ceres and trapped him there, as we did. Checkmate." "Or check out. So when he don't come back, they smell a rat. And I ain't planning on being around to chew rat poison. My grandpappy killed a councillor once. Poor grandpappy. Hey, there's the rock." There was no outward sign of life on the barren little planetoid, but as the ship came to a grinding stop in a narrow gorge, a concealing shield snapped over them, and a crudely painted sign blazed out in phosphorescent gaudiness on one rocky wall. "Simulacra Limited, Jeremiah Greek Proprietor." A line in Greek characters. "Specialist," another line in Greek characters. Fleigh came out of the lock first, and paused while he waited for Slim to shoulder the tarpaulin-covered Curtis and follow. He grinned and pointed at the Greek characters in the sign. "Magician and wonder-worker. Specialist in imitation and mockery," he translated. "I looked it up on Mars, so don't go thinking it's some kind of spell. Now if the old fool will open up." Max remembered his own preconceptions of Greeks' process, pictured various impressive-looking apparatus, which included a large tube through which some sort of lightning zigzagged, and a beautiful woman taking form from a stream of transmuted elements streaming from the top. It was nothing like such cinematic legerdemain, of course. "Why ain't English good enough for him?" complained Slim. "I don't go for that magic stuff, Max. We been—" But the Sigma was already swinging back on his tips to reveal a passage through the rock. A little shriveled man in tattered shorts and thick-lensed glasses stood motioning them in impatiently, and the door closed silently when they obeyed his summons. They headed down a side passage toward a ramp, and the sound of busy humming. Greek threw open a door and pointed to a table where the duplicate of Councilor Curtis lay, with a duplicate Jeremiah Greek fussing over it and humming through his nose. The guide dropped to a bench and began removing his chest and inserting a fresh power pack between two terminals. Slim's mouth dropped open, and his burden slipped from his back to the floor with a sodden thump, while he stared from one Greek to the other, and back to the first. His fingers were stretched in the ancient sign of the horns as he watched the changing of accumulators, and his voice was hoarse and uncertain. "A damned robot!" "Not a robot, a simulacrum," denied the owl-eyed man who must have been the original of the metal creature. "I'm a mimicist, not a creator. A robot has independent life, but that's only a limited copy of my memories and habits, like this phony Curtis. And those tapes you brought me, Fleigh, they stink." He gestured toward the spools of the marvelous wire that could record electromagnetic waves of any type of frequency up to several million megacycles. In one corner, a stereo player was running one off, but the vision screen was fuzzy, and the voice part was a mass of gibberish. Fleigh scowled at it, and turned back suspiciously to Greek. "Sure you know how to use them? Those were made by—" "By a fool who had a shield leak in his scanner. Only a few were any good. I was using pancyclic tape before you ever saw a stereo record. Where do you think I impress my simulacrum's memory? On a real brain? It takes miles of tape to feed the electrons. I did the best I could, but— Here, take a look." He reached into the false Curtis's mouth and did something that made the figure sit up suddenly. Max went over and muttered into the thing's ear, but after the first few answers it lapsed into sullen silence, and he swung back toward Greek. "I told you Curtis had to be perfect. This wouldn't fool a Jovian." "And I told you I wasn't Jehovah. I specialize in mechanical imitations," Greek answered shortly. "Bum tape, bum simulacrum. If you brought me some decent reels, I'll see what I can do, though." Fleigh grunted and yanked the tarpaulin off the real Curtis. At the sight, new interest appeared on Greek's face, and he came over to examine the councillor, but stopped after a cursory look had shown that the man was still alive. He nodded. "That's more like it, Fleigh. I'll set up an encephalograph and ideaform analyzer and record directly off his mind. It's better than feeding impressions from tape anyway, though I always use an editing circuit before. Okay, you'll get something of his own mother would swear was perfect." "When?" "Depends. Narrowband analysis would take a couple weeks, but it'd be permanent. If I run an all-wave impressor in, the tapes will be barely affected. I can do it in 10-12 hours, but your simulacrum will begin to fade in a week, and wash out completely in a month." "Suits me," Fleigh decided. "We don't need him more than a few days. Any place where Slim and I can catch up on our sleep while you finish." Greek's double came to life at a signal, and led them down a series of rock corridors to a room that lacked nothing in comfort, then went silently out and left them alone. To Fleigh's relief, Slim tested the bed in sour displeasure, pulled a blanket off, and rolled up on the floor, leaving the flotation mattress unoccupied. He had as little use for such luxuries as his boss had for his presence in the same bed. Max climbed in and adjusted the speed dial and perfect comfort with a relaxed grunt of pleasure. He had no intention of sleeping, though, while things that concerned him were going on. 3 hours later he heaved out and slipped silently down the rocky halls on sponge rubber slippers. But his training had covered the stupidity of spy stereos. There was nothing stealthy about his entry into the laboratory. Greek looked up from a maze of wires and gadget with faint surprise but no suspicion. "Couldn't sleep," Fleigh volunteered apologetically. "I was wondering if you had any barbiturates." A few minutes later he took the tablet from Greek's double and turned back down the hallway with a muttered thanks. He had learned all he wanted to know. Both Greeks and Curtises were present and accounted for where they belonged, and the mimicist was busy about his work. There was no funny business involved. Actually, he had expected none, but it never did any harm to make sure of such things when dealing with men who were outside the law of either the Plutarchy or the Council. Slim was snoring and kicking about on the floor when he returned, and he grinned as he plopped back onto the mattress. The outlaws were useful enough now, but once Earth took over the mandate, something would have to be done about them. Too many were the wrong sort to fit into the Plutarchy. Fleigh stretched with a self-satisfied yawn and slipped into well-earned sleep. Greek's simulacrum wakened them in the morning and led them back to the laboratory where the scientist was waiting beside the imitation Curtis. The real councillor must have been drugged, for he lay unconscious on one of the tables. Fleigh wasted only a casual glance at him and then turned to the new simulacrum as Greek flipped it on. This time his tests were longer, and there were no sullen silences from the imitation. His response was quick, sure, and completely correct. The real Curtis could have done no better, and Fleigh stepped back at last and nodded his approval. He demanded a perfect simulacrum, and it had been delivered. "You're sure it has a good, strong desire to live?" he asked briefly as he fished into his bag for the little prepared relay that was ready. Greek smiled faintly. "They all have that. They couldn't pass as normal men without it. And if your dimensions were correct, you should have no trouble installing your relay." He slipped aside the blouse to reveal a small cavity in the back of the simulacrum, with a bundle of little wires which Fleigh hooked into the relay. It slipped in and locked firmly. Greek unclipped the tiny switch from inside the machine's mouth. The animation within the simulacrum disappeared at once, to snap back again as a switch on Fleigh's bag was pressed. A little circle of the pancyclic strip moved over a scanner inside the bag, sending out a complex wave, while a receiver in the simulacrum's back responded by closing the relay. Then the animation was cut off again, and came back at once on a second pressure of the switch. "Attempted removal of the relay will destroy all circuits, just as you ordered," Greek assured the operative. "Well?" Fleigh's face mirrored complete satisfaction. "You get the fire emeralds, as promised." He reached into the bag and came out with a little bundle. A grin stretched across his face. It stayed there while Greek moved forward quickly to stagger back with a chopped-off scream as the slugs poured into his face and exploded his head into a mangled mess of blood and grey tissue. For a second, the Greek double moved forward, but it turned with a shriek and went down the hall at a clumsy run as Fleigh ripped the smoking gun from the package. He let it go. Curtis's head dissolved under a second series of slugs, and only the simulacrum of the consular was left with the laboratory with the two men. Slim closed his mouth slowly and reached for his green narcotic, but he made no protest. The other moved about, gathering up combustibles and stacking them in a corner, then setting fire to the pile. "Which take care of almost everything, Slim," Fleigh said calmly. They headed out and down the hall toward their ship, with the imitation Curtis moving quietly along behind. Another slug from the gun destroyed the lock on the big Sigma, and they pushed through, out into the rocky gorge. Nothing left to chance, and a perfect red herring to cover up Curtis' disappearance. Slim ducked into the lock and went forward to the controls. Grandpappy'd sure have admired you, Max. Used to look just the same when he drilled somebody he didn't like. All set for takeoff." "Forgetting anything, Slim?" The outlaw looked up in puzzled surprise, while Fleigh shook his head and went over to the receiver. There was no sense in trying to teach the fool anything, apparently, but at least he might have learned elementary caution from his mode of life. The Plutarch operative ripped out the tape from the illegal all-wave recorder and slipped it into a playback slot while slow comprehension crossed the other's face. But everything was in order, with the usual hash of faint signals on various frequencies. There were no signs of a strong response, such as would have been made by any attempt on Greeks' part to double-cross him with a call to the outside. He set the receiver to record, and went toward the rear cabin and the simulacrum, while the ship blasted off and headed towards Mars. The false Curtis was already at a table, and groping through a bag of notes the original councillor had carried. It looked up as Fleigh came in, grimaced, and went on organizing the paper before it. The operative dropped to a chair with his familiar humorless chuckle. "You realize your life is dependent on obedience, Curtis?" "Would I have let you kill myself otherwise?" the thing asked grimly. "Leave that control gadget of yours where I can get it, and you'll feel the difference between my hands and mere flesh ones. But meantime, I'll cooperate, since I have no choice. I suppose you intend helping with my speech before the council." Fleigh's appreciation for the peculiar genius of Greek went up several points as he assented tersely. The thing was perfect, or so nearly so that it seemed to consider itself the real man. There would be no trouble on that score. As for the control bag, he had no intention of letting that out of his hands until the simulacrum was turned off. It gestured toward the notes with a motion peculiar to Curtis. "You'd only ruin anything you edited, Fleigh. I'm perfectly capable of writing the thing myself, and it'll sound like me. But if I'm going to give you a clean sheet and not make the whole council suspicious, I'll need more information than I have. I must have the whole picture, so I can take care of all objections without running counter to what some other councillors may know already. So, I think you'd better learn to address me as Councillor Curtis." "Quite so, Councillor," Fleigh agreed, and this time the amusement in his laugh was genuine. "Now, if you'll tell me what you know of our plans and methods, I'll fill in the blanks. But I'll want to see that speech when you're finished." It was amazing, the amount of evidence Curtis had managed to accumulate in a brief week, or perhaps much of it had been in his hands before, and only needed organizing against what they had let him find on series. It was enough to have ruined all hopes of Earth's getting the mandate, and seriously endangering her relations with the Planet Council in addition. Fleigh made a mental note to press for an investigation of some of the Outland operatives as he began filling in the missing links in the other's information. Curtis took the facts down in a notebook, grim-faced and silent, checked them back, and reached for the typewriter. The first part of the speech he had meant to deliver needed but slight modification, and Fleigh read it over the simulacrum's shoulder as it operated the machine. Then the going grew tougher, and there were long pauses while the thing considered, revising a word here or changing a paragraph there. It disregarded Fleigh's suggestions with the same disdain that would have been on the real councillor's face, and the operative began to realize that it was justified. When it came to writing speeches, he was only an amateur, and this was professional work. He was beginning to regret that the thing could have had a life of only from a week to 10 days when it finished. Earth could have used such a propagandist, particularly one accepted on the council as Mars's chief representative. Curtis' speeches had always been good, but he had never realized that the man's talents would have been equally good on propaganda. It was hard to believe that this was fiction, as he listened to the calm, assured voice running through it, apparently reciting only the simple truth, and yet colouring every word with some trick of oratory that seemed to make it glow with virtue and integrity. "Perfect," he commented when it was finished. He cut off the relay signal, watched the simulacrum slip to the floor, and went forward to the control cabin with a full measure of satisfaction. Earth could not fail. And already the red disk of Mars was large and close on the viewplate. Fleigh hadn't realized the time the writing of the speech had taken, but he did not regret a second of it as Slim began nursing the ship down through the thin atmosphere toward the solar center. The taste of coming victory was strong in Max Fleigh as he waited outside the Martian house the next day, but Slim was still glum and morose. Part of that was probably due to his orders to stay out of the usual outlaw haunts on the planet, where the police might have picked him up and ruined the whole plan. The rest, Fleigh decided, was just his natural fear of what he could not understand. The outlaw was grumbling and turning his lucky ghost charm over and over in his palms. "Leaving the thing run around this way. We've been lucky, Max, but 'tain't reasonable to figure it'll hold. You should have let me tail him." "Sure, Slim. People expect him to go around with you at his heels, no doubt." Fleigh spat dango seeds out of the open car window and took another bite of the cool fruit before going on. "We have to let him circulate. No councillor just back from a 2-week trip would hole up before his meeting, when he had instructions to pick up any last-minute details piling in. Besides, we're not dealing with Curtis now, but with a machine, and it knows who its master is. The minute I cut the relay, or it gets 10 miles away from me, no life." He spotted the simulacrum coming down the steps and jumped out to open the car door. Slim grunted dourly, pulling his chauffeur's cap further down his forehead. But he took the curt order from Curtis with no other protests and headed the big car toward the council chambers. The councillor passed over 2 slips of elaborate pasteboard and leaned back against the sheet. "Passes for the 2 of you. Are you sure Slim knows what he's to do?" There was a disgusted sound from the front, but Fleigh ignored it. "He'd better. We've been over it often enough, but go ahead and make sure." The simulacrum ticked off the points with incisive authority. The council chamber was radiation-proof, and since Curtis would not be trusted with a relay signal, the success of the whole thing depended on Slim's behavior. Max had secured a duplicate of his signal generator which the outlaw was to use outside the assembly, while Fleigh went inside with his and waited. The operative had developed complete confidence in the ability of the false Curtis, and he was sure of his own part. It was all up to Slim. There was no reason for him to fail, and he had always taken orders well enough before. Actually, it all went off with perfect smoothness. The guards passed him in after a careful scrutiny of his permit, and he carried the briefcase that held the generator up to the gallery and turned it on. Seconds later, the simulacrum came through the big doorway with only a slight flicker of uncertainty as the anti-radiation shield touched him, and he passed from one generator to the other. Curtis walked along the aisle with the proper confidence and attention to his friends, presented his credentials for the purely perfunctory examination, and turned off into one of the little council rooms. 2 of the other Martian councillors followed him and passed out of Fleigh's field of view, but he was not worried about that. Slim came slouching down the gallery stairs and dropped into a seat beside the operative, putting the duplicate generator between his feet. "Satisfied?" "Perfect," Fleigh assured him. They would reverse it going out. After that, Curtis would announce that he was leaving on a long trip to Ganymede, and they would be able to dispose of the simulacrum without any parts left to show what he was. Then Curtis came back into the main chamber. Apparently the council had been waiting for his return, for the sergeant-at-arms waved for order, and the meeting began, with almost no preliminaries. Earth brought up the subject of the mandate, and the head of the Venus Council began to come to his feet. But Curtis was up first, and the chair recognized him. Fleigh relaxed completely as the familiar words of the speech began to come to him, while the Venusians glanced about in surprise, and then began to listen. A moment later they were under the sway of his oratory. The single speech should do it, since the question had been tentatively decided in favor of Earth at their last meeting, pending Curtis's investigation. By night, the mandate should be a fait accompli, and Earth could begin moving out her mercenary legions in the squat mining freighters. Fleigh had a pretty good idea of who would lead them. He'd been in line for promotion for some time already, and the Plutarch had dropped hints of the outcome of success. It would be good to leave the dubious position of operative, and become a legally recognized governor of the Mandate planetoids, to settle down and begin organizing his own private little plans for the Plutarch's job. Slim nudged him with a bony knee, but Fleigh was too wrapped in his own thoughts to bother until the other seized his elbow and hissed at him. Then he came out of his daydreams. Something was going on. The councillors were paying too careful attention, and the Earth delegation didn't look right. In a second his mind was back on the speech, and the words came to a chilling focus in the air. Found the organization inconceivably complex, and yet the basic pattern is old as the barbarism that prompted it. Gentlemen, I have only my word as evidence now, but I can name names and give exact locations that will enable our planetary police to confirm every word of it before night falls on this meaning. The Plutarch of Earth, on the 20th of April, 42 years ago, gave the following orders, which I quote. Fleigh grabbed for Slim's generator and yanked the button savagely, but still the damning words went on, detail piling on exact detail, while Secret Servicemen moved forward to cut the speaker off from the Earth delegates. Their rudeness was an open declaration that Earth was immediately severed from the Council. Max ripped out the generator, crushing the delicate tubes in his hands. He was stamping on his own device at the same time, but the voice went on unchecked. Down on the floor, Curtis looked upwards without pausing in his detailed list of evidence, found the operative's eye and grinned. Then he resumed his normal gravity and went on. Slim's hands were trembling and fumbling over his charm. Fleigh practically carried him over to the aisle and dragged him along as he made his way up the infinite distance to the gallery door. Every step was made with the expectation of a shouted order from Curtis that would send the big explosive slugs tearing through him. But it did not come. Instead, there was only the quiet continuance of the speech, and Slim's hoarse prayers to the ghosts of the charm to save them. Surprisingly, the doors opened in the hands of the courteous guards, and the hall was before them, with no police in sight. Max cut Slim's babbled relief off with a crisp whisper. "We're not out of it, you fool. 10 to 1, it's cat and mouse, with us the losers. But if we're going to make use of the 10th chance, shut up, walk, damn it, and grin." There was another flight of stairs leading down, a long hall, and a second door that opened promptly and politely as they neared it. Then the main steps led down to the street. It was impossible that the simulacrum could have given no orders for their arrest, as impossible as the relay could be tampered with. But the big car waited at the curb, and there still no police. Reaction left Slim drooling narcotic juice over the hands that were caressing and kissing the charm. Fleigh yanked him savagely into the car and gunned the electros. It went tearing out into the street under full power, while a wild yell of despair ripped out of the outlaw's throat. "My ghost charm!" He was pawing frantically at the door lock, with his face swiveled around toward the bright receding twinkle of the metal piece on the sidewalk behind. "Max! Max!" "Shut up and stay put. There must be 100 more of those things you can buy if we get out of this." Fleigh freed a hand and forced the cringing fool back into the seat, where he relaxed woodenly, terror fading out to sullen despair that gradually mingled with doubt. "Then let's get out of quick, Max. Once we hit Earth, I know a guy's got another. It ain't as good as a ghost with it is mine, but it ain't no fake, neither. You got to give me enough to get it, Max." Fleigh hid his thin grin from the other. They'd need more than a ghost charm or even planning if they ever went to Earth. He'd seen what happened to failures there, and he knew that it would be better to walk into the nearest planet police bureau. But he reached over soothingly and patted the outlaw's shoulder. "Sure, Slim. We'll get you another, maybe before we leave here." It shouldn't be hard to find one of the charm peddlers and dope up a story. There was a place on Venus where they could hide, once Slim worked up his nerve to pilot them there, and provided that their luck held long enough to keep the police from impounding the little craft. But the hideout would take money, and that had to come first. Planning took care of that. He'd always been careful to avoid tying his personal fortune up in the Earth operative strongholds. He swung the car around a corner, glanced up at a jeweller's sign, and cursed without slowing down. The red light was on, warning that it had been raided. One of his secret quarters gone. He stopped obediently for a through highway, and roared on. But the second was no better. There was sweat on his forehead, and his hands were slippery with it when he headed out Mars Center Canal into the suburbs. Damn Curtis! It was impossible for him to have found the hideout, or should have been. But there was no warning light in the window of the third and last place. The lawyer's faded sign swung into the thin wind, and everything was serenely peaceful. Fleigh jerked Slim out of the car, set his automatic chauffeur, and let it go rolling off. Then he moved up the steps with the outlaw at his heels, listened cautiously at the door, and nodded. The steady click of a typewriter indicated that the scrawny little secretary was doing the routine office work, and Sammy must have been undisturbed. He opened the door eagerly, to a louder clicking from the typewriter. Above it, Curtis looked up with an assured smile and waved the grandfather of all hand weapons at him in genial greeting. "Come in, Max," he said cordially. "Like my doubles of speech?" Slim's trembling hand fumbled out automatically in the sign of the horns. His blanched mouth worked furiously, but the words refused to come until Curtis turned to him, then jerked back, waving his fingers. "He couldn't have. We'd have beat him. Max, he's dead. He's a ghost." Fleigh's hand groped for him, and missed. Another apparition came into the room from the inner office. This one was a shriveled little man, with owl eyes that blinked at them out of thick-lensed spectacles. Jeremiah Greek picked up a pencil with a contented grin, drew it across the bare flesh of his arm, and held the red mark that rose on the skin out toward the outlaw. "In the flesh," he stated. But Slim was no longer listening. Slowly, as if moved by worn-down clockworks, he slid down the wall, and his dead-faced head bent forward to meet the knees that drew upwards. There he stayed, motionless. "If that scattertonic return to the fetal position is an all-time record for speed," Curtis commented with quiet interest. "Sit down, Max. You seem to have overestimated your companion's moral fibre and underestimated your opponent's. Never count on luck. It takes planning to get anywhere in this universe. By the way, Jeremiah Greek is the original inventor of pancyclic tape. You should have checked up on him before you trusted him, and found out the way your Plutarchy gypped him out of his invention. He wasn't the sort of man who'd cooperate very well with Earth. In fact, he was the sort you could and would fake a tape for your recorder to cover up the call they put in under my code to the Martian Council." Fleigh moved toward the chair as the gun commanded, only half conscious of the words. He sank into a sitting position, his mind churning savagely and getting nowhere. "Play along. Keep your eyes open. If you let the other guy make the moves, he'll slip up somewhere." It was basic training to operatives, though there was uncertainty in even that logic now. But there was nothing else to do. Greek picked up the account. "With a promise of secrecy from Councillor Curtis, and a chance to do legitimate research here, I felt quite free to drop my very doubtful loyalty to my native planet, Mr. Fleigh. Those 2 simulacra you shot were crude, and the brain and blood imitation was quite poor, I thought. But fortunately, you didn't investigate thoroughly." "I didn't think the relay control could fail, so simply let the simulacrum collapse and took its place." Fleigh was forcing himself to casualness, while his brain hashed over all the rules for upsetting a trap. But it returned inevitably to the basic need of stalling for time and keeping them talking. "Not at all," Curtis corrected them. "We were late returning, so they simply used an all-wave receiver to record your control signal on pancyclic tape, inserting it into a generator, and the simulacrum had his freedom in his pocket 2 minutes after you turned on your control in the council chamber. You really didn't think I'd leave my speech in the middle to chase you when I had a perfectly good double, surely?" Fleigh's eyes darted to Slim, but there would be no help from that quarter. Not a muscle had moved since the outlaw had collapsed onto the floor. He forced himself to relax deliberately. Relax. As long as he was tensed up in the chair, they'd watch him, but they'd be less cautious if he seemed to abandon hope. And he was younger and faster than they were, in spite of his fat. Greek's amused cackle broke his chain of thought. So simple a solution, Max. But of course, an involute brain would miss just that. That's fine, relax. And when you start anything, you'll be surprised to find how quickly and efficiently a couple of sentimental visionary fools can shoot. Or do you think, Councillor, that we were really such fools? I doubt it, Curtis answered, with the same hard amusement in his voice. As I see it, a reactionary is simply unable to adapt to new conditions. He's filled with a blind, stubborn dependence on the rude past, and brute force is an admission of that intellectual poverty. Max, you should have studied history better. The addle-pated idealists have a peculiar habit of winning. They stood there, grinning and studying their captive with the one thing in the universe he had never encountered: open contempt. Fleigh wet his lips, glancing from one to the other, and considering the hopeless distance to the door. And suddenly the beginnings of an idea permeated through the hard knot of fear in his brain. They didn't believe in brute force. They wouldn't kill him without provocation, and they couldn't turn him into the police. He swung back to Curtis, and this time there was a grin on his own lips. You said you promised Mr. Greek secrecy, Councillor, not immunity, because the old law against making robots is too strong, and simulacra could be considered robots. Well, just how do you figure you can turn me over to the authorities without breaking that promise and having him strung up beside me? I never meant to turn you in, Curtis answered. And you said yourself that brute force was stupid. Quite true. It was Greek who answered this time. But the rules of justice sometimes invoke it. The penalty for treason, like that for robotry, is still death, though we've abandoned most other reasons for capital punishment. Then turn me in, or kill me yourselves, and you'll find that brute force really is stupid on Mars. The police here are the best in the system, which is why I always prefer to do my little jobs elsewhere. You amateurs wouldn't have a chance, well? But he knew that he had them, and the taste of freedom in his mouth was sweet after the fear and hopelessness of their gloating power. He did not wait for an answering nod from them, but turned from his chair in calm assurance and headed for the door. Greek's voice interrupted his exit. Just a minute, Max. You really should know all your mistakes, and there's one we forgot. Never use a perfect simulacrum. It can't be perfect without thinking exactly like its original. The same mind must operate the same way. Your simulacrum was limited only by the time it could exist, and it knew that, as well as knowing it was useless among real men. So what? Fleigh asked jauntily, and reached for the door. And so long. Steel hands grabbed him, and a pair of arms with inhuman strength picked him up and turned him around to face the two men. Curtis dropped his gun onto the table with a slow, deliberate motion, holding the struggling operative with a single hand while he stretched the other out to Jeremiah Greek. Then he turned toward the door, dragging the fat body of Fleigh along without effort. So when you're found dead in your house, killed by the robot you were having built in some fiendish plot against Councillor Curtis, I don't think the police will worry, beyond seeing that both you and the robot are thoroughly beyond repair. There was bitterness in the voice of the simulacrum, but it was resolute and determined bitterness. When the real Curtis replaced me in the council chamber, he meant to make a few days of existence as pleasant as possible. But even a limited simulacrum likes to be useful. Come along, Max. Max Fleigh went along. There was nothing else he could do, as a duplicate of Curtis tossed him into a small car and began driving back toward the town and the house that had been his Martian home and soon would be his tomb. He couldn't even think straight, for his head insisted on dwelling on nonsense. Slim had been right, after all, and his ghost charm had brought him luck, even after he lost it. But for the man who had refused to believe in it, there was no hope for such insane oblivion. There was simply no hope of any kind.